All right. I am live streaming via YouTube and Twitch this very moment of recording, but I'm also going to be doing a recording. Hopefully, this background remover cooperates or blur. Um, so I apologize if that's probably going to be a thing. But anyways, I haven't done a video reaction at least I think in a few months or so. So I figured I'm going to try to give it a stab. Um, It's been a minute. I know, see all sorts of stuff. I got like an Epic Games code. I've been doing a lot of streaming, probably from, if you can tell, from my live tab. But yeah, I want to add back to. I want to try to do a genuine video reactions like I used to do quite a bit of. This one popped up in my uh, feed. It's very interesting concept. It's actually should probably. It's why does the Electoral College exist? I mean, especially if you're an American or just aware of American politics, it's quite a peculiar thing, the Electoral College. And Premoderist, this particular YouTube channel, has been on my radar for a minute or so, maybe since of last year or a couple years. I'm not sure it's been. I think it's been at least a couple years. I think, but this guy knows his stuff. This guy definitely, you know, peak good stuff. Good stuff. Very good educational stuff. Even if you don't even agree with some of his perspectives, you can be like, nah, I get where you're coming from. And that's always a good sign. Why does this have to be like right up here in order for the background filter not to like filter me out? Anyway, sorry. But yeah, so very good channel. Highly recommend, if especially into history. There's a couple other, you can see a couple other of his stuff up here. Like I said, highly recommend. Guys, it's just good history material.
When the United States Constitution was written in 1787, they included a provision for how to elect the president, which involved something called the Electoral College. Now, modern Americans, many of them don't really understand why the Electoral College exists. And even
And I'm going to say for me, I think the quick summary I would say before this is it's essentially because of technology and conveniences at the time. Um, and also kind of how their relationship, the colonies' relationships were to each other. That's, I would say, the short sweet of it. But he's going to about to explain it in a much more long, elaborate, better way.
those Americans who
I'm
support
going
the
to try to
Electoral
react to it.
College, they might support it for reasons that were not the original reasons that the framers had for creating it to begin with.
Uh-huh.
So I thought with this video, I would just explain why the framers of the Constitution created the Electoral College, why they had this be the mechanism for selecting the president. Now, for a little bit of background, the United States originally was 13 separate countries, de facto independent states that
Colonies.
leagued together into a confederation.
Like their relationship to each other was for a while, like was kind of like similar to how it would be with like Canada and like United States, kind of. I mean, a bit more like still under the same crown, but at this end of the day, just think about like the relationship between all the Canadian provinces had within each other and stuff. It's kind of like that, but even more. I would say more so, but.
And they eventually came up with a set of rules to govern their interactions. It was called the Articles of Confederation.
Right.
Now, during the course of the 1780s, there was increasing discontent with how the system was working under the Articles of Confederation, and many people felt that it needed to be revised or even overhauled and replaced with something different.
Right.
So most of the states sent delegates to Philadelphia,
which makes sense because by that time the relationship evolved too, was evolving.
That would replace the old Articles of Confederation, that would create a more unified country. The states would continue to have their separate identities and would continue to function as governments. But at the same time, there would be a federal government that would be separate from the states and over the states.
Yes.
But it would not simply be a federation of states. It would also be a government that derived its authority directly from the people. The delegates met.
I think that's like one. That's probably the big difference too, is how direct the people would have even any sort of power.
And then they finished their work in the middle of September. So it was 3.5, almost 4 months that they were hashing out the new constitution.
Oh, this is a. Let's actually remove the subtitles here for a second. So So I see. That's one of the things he also does for these channels too, that I really love. Is this guy? Well, he will also like do these little time tables like this, and he will let you know about like random other stuff going on in the world. And I personally like that because I like kind of tying all that stuff together and then think about, okay, so while this was going on here, that was going on there. I don't know, I always think that stuff is just interesting. I don't even. Oop, I don't want to move that. Just that. Why are you doing that? Yeah. Let's do that. Move you over. I'm just going to shrink you down for a moment here. Let's just shrink you down. So I don't need to be that big. But yeah, so anyways, we can look at this. Put you right here for now. Yeah, Tokugawa Inuri. Sorry I'm sorry for the mispronunciation. But anyways, becomes a shogun. We got this guy becomes a shogun of Japan. Ancient slavery society founded in London. The Constitutional Convention. See, that's interesting to me. Let's think about that. Like, so this you're going to start to get this little bit of a fever of anti-slaveriness. You know, to the point where they can even have like a whole society. You know, like so. I mean, society, not really. Group of folks. Then a little bit later, you have the Northwest Orient. Mozart, right now, at this time. Russo-Turkish War. The Constitution confirms. And William is restored to power in another. Wow. So there's stuff going on. You know what I mean? Like, we always think about, like, the modern era as, like, being so active. And, like, it is. There's a lot of stuff going on. Like, any day, every given hour right now, there's a bunch of stuff going on. They're probably, we can say it's historical in some way or fashion of the word. Look at all this, what's going on. All this, what was going on within, like, not even a year. I mean, March, nothing, they didn't even include anything for March here or October here. This is just April to September of 1787. Look at all this stuff going on here. Anyways.
The new government that they created would have 3 separate branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. And the executive branch, the branch in charge of executing the laws, would be headed by a single individual called a president. And one of the main issues that they discussed that summer was how the president would be selected.
It's like some Schoolhouse Rock type stuff going on now.
The idea of having the president chosen directly by the voters was floated at the convention, and it had its proponents. There was James Wilson and Gouverneur Morris. They were both delegates from Pennsylvania.
Oh,
Pennsylvania,
I like them.
Pennsylvania delegation in general.
That's my bias.
Mainly behind the idea of having direct election of the president. But when they would have votes in the convention on it, the Pennsylvania delegation was always voted down. The other delegates, most of the other delegates who were at the convention, didn't think it was a good idea. And they had several reasons for that. One is they, acknowledging the fact that the United States is a very large country, large geographical area with millions of people in it.
See, this was alluding to at the time, the technology.
Hundreds of thousands of square miles.
Technology, yep.
States.
Mm-hmm.
You can't expect that they would all vote, or a majority of them would vote for a single person. Bear in mind, this was the first time that there was going to be a democratic system operating on such a large geographical scale.
I think all of that aside, I think, like I said, then the biggest argument for it really is just like, it's in terms of geography, it's just the technology of the time. It's just that simple. It's just like, well, it's to have such a direct democracy, it's just the logistics of it. It's just not nearly as simple as, say, just having these electoral college, have these people direct, represent this, area of folks, and it's a streamlines a lot of that voting for a time when like they just couldn't just to count that many votes and to do all that stuff. The logistical nightmare of it. So much more of a logistical nightmare.
There had been democratic systems before this, but they'd always operated on the local scale, local town.
Right.
Democracy
exactly.
At the town level,
because,
on the city level.
Because it was so much easier.
There were city-states that had democratic systems. But this was the first country that was of such large geographical scope that was going to have a democratic system. So most of the delegates just assumed that having a direct election operating on the entire national level would just be unworkable. You're going to have, tons of different candidates being voted on. Everybody's going to vote for people that they know, and they don't mainly
which is funny because there's a lot of voting systems that would work that out no problem.
Or hundreds
honestly.
of names receiving votes, and people are generally going to vote for people within their own state. And that would favor the large states, the states with large populations, because people from large population states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, they would vote for fellow Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers. None of them would be voting for somebody from New Jersey or Delaware or New Hampshire. And so every president's going to come from a large population state. That's a non-starter for people from the small states. And then another issue that was brought up by Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts was, and I think a few other people may have spoken on this, was that given the fact that the voters are going to be low information voters, they're not going to know lots about people from other states.
Isn't he the gerrymandering guy?
By
I
the
think
way,
that's the
when they were
gerrymandering
talking
dude. The
at
guy who
convention
gerrymandering is named
about
after.
Voting and how people are going to choose the president, they didn't talk in terms of policy. I think people nowadays oftentimes think of you vote for the presidential candidate who best reflects your policy goals. But the way the delegates at the convention were talking about it, they were thinking in terms of voters trying to vote for somebody who think they would have the best character for the job. They'd be the best fit for the job. Mm-hmm. They weren't thinking in terms of long-term policies and people having policy arguments. So they were thinking, well, how is someone going to be able to evaluate somebody's character? You can evaluate somebody's character if you've been following them in state politics or local politics. So somebody from your own state, you might...
See, this is funny because this is how I actually think about politics. I'm becoming more and more about character type person myself. So it's very fascinating to think that he's saying, like, no, man, this is kind of how it was. Like, this is how, like, America, like, these literal founding fathers and literal, like, people founding the country. This is literally what was in their minds when thinking about, like, how you have presidents and all this stuff, like how the system of governance was working. So it's a little validating in a certain way, especially as an American. I mean, like, hey, I could kind of now argue from a point of history, but that's always a fun point of argument to have.
You might be familiar with them.
It pisses off the conservatives who want to argue against you because you're like, no, actually, I have tradition.
But somebody from a different state, especially if they're from a distant state, where you don't know much about that state, you don't know much about who the leading figures are in that state, how would you be able to evaluate whether the character of that person is, whether that person's qualified?
Well, I can actually see some validity in his argument, especially back in the day.
Raised the concern, well, what if you have some kind of concerted effort, you have some organization that's organized in all the different states, and they organize to have a single individual put forward before all the voters and persuade the voters from different states to vote for this person, and they would be in charge of the narrative about that person. They'd be able to tell people, perhaps misleadingly, about the character of this person and get a bunch of people to vote for somebody who's actually not fit for the job, but who, by getting elected, will be able to use the job for their own profit and the profit of their families.
I mean, political parties kind of ruined a lot of this anyways.
They were concerned. Those are the kinds of concerns that were being raised at the convention. How do we prevent bad outcomes? Somebody being elected president who's not actually somebody that the voters would want, but they don't have enough information to know. And so because of that, the delegates defaulted to having Congress choose the president. And this was kind of a natural choice for them. It was the default choice.
Right.
Because
I can understand
under most
why.
Of the state constitutions, which were written in the Revolutionary period in the 1770s.
Balance of powers.
They had their state legislatures choosing the state governor or the state president. Back in those days, some states, the chief executive was called governor, and in some states it was called president. But either way, most of the time, the state legislature chose the governor. There were only a couple states.
I don't remember which states, though, did the president thing. I would have to look that up. Because I don't remember that being too much of a... I think he's right. I mean, I'm pretty sure he's right. I just don't remember which states off the top of my head did that. Well, I mean, at the time there had been colonies, but you know what I mean.
That had popular election of governor, and that was in New York and Massachusetts.
Okay.
And so that was the default. That's what they just naturally went to. The initial working draft for the Constitution that they were working on was called the Virginia Plan. Virginia Plan wrote into it from the beginning what we now call the Congress. Congress would choose the president. And then the small states with small populations, were disgruntled with the direction the convention was taking, and so they put forward an alternate plan called the New Jersey Plan.
Oh, yeah, the
that
New
had
Jersey plan. I forgot about the New
structured
Jersey
a bit
plan.
differently, but also in that plan, Congress would choose the president. That was just the default position that they kept going back to. And because of that, during the course of the summer, the working draft almost always had.
Which is, I'm sorry, I need to, because it's just funny that they thought like that, especially because for me, and pretty sure other people brought this up, and it's ultimately why this wasn't the case. But like, I'm pretty sure they're going to be like, well, doesn't that impact potential balance of power between the branches? If one branch is kind of doing so much to directly appoint, I mean, they kind of do that already with Supreme Court, but with what the Supreme Court can do, it kind of still makes sense. I mean, in fact, some people still say the Supreme Court, even despite the fact that it's really like the president's despite being appointed by the other branches, well, especially presidency, it's still arguably even more powerful in some ways. I mean, so, anyways, I'm getting off the weeds, but the point being, I always say, well, this could balance. So I'm curious. I'm trying to remember who
The president being chosen
did
by
that.
Congress. And there were
Was
some
it
reasons why
Jefferson,
they thought this
maybe?
would be a good idea. For one
'Cause he was a
thing,
states guy.
members of Congress would be familiar with the leading figures in the different states,
Mm-hmm.
at least by reputation, if not directly. And so they would be in a better position to be able to evaluate who would be a fit person for the job.
Of course, they're not probably necessarily
Another
or not caring about the
point
corruption
that
factor
some
of
delegates
that.
brought up was, Congress is going to make
Be
the
a buddies
laws,
buddy
and
club.
then the job of the president is to execute those laws. So it makes sense to have Congress figure out who they want to be in charge of executing the laws that they are making. Not all the delegates felt that way, but that was another point.
I mean, I do understand that logic.
The delegates who objected to that objected to it on the basis of the fact that that would mean that you're not keeping a strict separation of the two branches,
Yeah,
legislative and executive.
that's a good
And
one
it was
too. That's a
important to
good
the
point. It's
delegates
not
that
even
they
just necessarily the
maintain a
balance of
separation
power, but the
of the branches.
separation. That's a good point.
This
That's a valid
was
point.
an idea
That's probably even
that
better
went
than what
back
I was
to
thinking. Really.
Montesquieu, this idea of if you have separation of powers into different branches of the government, then you
I mean, they're
prevent
kinda
any
the
one
same. It's kinda
branch
the
from
same
becoming
difference,
too
but-
powerful and therefore becoming a tyranny.
Right.
And so if you have the president being chosen by Congress, then that puts Congress in the position of being the dominant branch of the government.
Yep.
And the president would just be a creature of Congress.
Yep.
So how do we prevent that from happening? And
See, that-
so
I
they
would've been
came
one of those
up
dudes.
with this workaround, or this kind of
That would've been me.
amelioration for it, where they would have the president serve a really long term and not be eligible for re-election. And the idea behind that was the Congress would choose the president, and then once the president had been chosen and he was in office, he would have plenty of time in office to
Blah,
pursue whatever
blah,
policy he
blah,
wanted to
blah,
pursue,
blah.
and the Congress couldn't remove him.
Whatever, MC.
Impeachment was another issue they went back and forth on, whether the president would be impeachable. But anyway,
This is a fun channel. You should
the
check
number
this
they
channel
usually
out
had was
sometime.
7 years for a term of office.
If you're into this sort
Although
of stuff.
sometimes some delegates would propose
Yeah, it's all
longer
sorts of fun
terms,
stuff.
10, 12, 15 years, but they usually had 7 years as the term of office for the president. They thought that would give the president sufficient scope to be able to pursue whatever policies he wanted to pursue, carry out the job as he saw fit without having to worry about Congress.
And see, I kind of relate to this sort of thinking. That kind of makes sense. Although I probably would have made more advocate for I would have been like, hey, we can give them at least a decade, but also make it make it not too difficult to remove them from power if they get too corrupt, because that's one of the issues I would say. That's funny. Why you don't like the sea foam shirt? Don't like that color? What's wrong with the color? But yeah, so no.
And then having the president not be eligible for re-election, they thought that was also really important.
Sure.
Because if you have Congress choose the president, and then the president's sitting in that office thinking, if I please the Congress, they'll re-elect me,
Right.
then he's not really going to be independent of Congress. He's just going to be trying to please Congress.
It's just
So they
logical.
made the
That's the
position,
logical
okay, he
conclusion
cannot
of
be
things.
re-eligible. He cannot be, re-electable. Meanwhile, there were two features of congressional apportionment
Yes.
that would later have an effect on how the presidential election would be figured out. One was
Census for small citizens. Connecticut compromise 3/5. Yeah.
the
Look,
Connecticut Compromise, and the other
we
was
really
the
should have dealt.
Massachusetts
America should have
Declaration.
dealt with that slavery
The
issue from the
Connecticut
get-go.
Compromise was a compromise between the large states and the small states. Meaning, when we say large states, small states, we mean
We should
population
have just
states,
not
large population states, and
permitted it.
small population
As
states.
much of the economic hit would have
The
been,
people in the
it would have
small
been obviously
population
worth it.
states were
I mean, just for the
afraid
human rights
that
part
creating
of
a
it,
closer union of
the
the states
consistency of it.
would endanger
That's
their
just
own
important
independence
for
and
it.
sovereignty.
You
They
know.
were afraid the large states would take advantage of the small states, perhaps even swallow them up. And so
I can see that.
were
Why they would think
determined
that.
during the course of the convention
Why they would
to
think that.
protect the interests of small states at all costs. In fact, the government of Delaware.
See, that's one thing I kind of am respecting more and more as I'm like, think as he's kind of recounting. Like a lot of this stuff I kind of was familiar with. He's just kind of like, I'm like, oh yeah, there was that. Oh yeah, there was that. A lot of this, like the Connecticut Compromise and New Jersey Compromise, and like all these different things that they were thinking, like the way they were thinking at the time. And so it's like, okay, I understand, like, especially for the time, why the Electoral College was made. Like as anti-Electoral College as I am, especially for now, at least for back then, I'm sympathetic. I'm like, okay, I get it. You know?
When it sent its delegates to Philadelphia, specifically told them
I
that
just
they were
don't think
not
it
to
works for
agree
that.
to any
But that's a
plan
whole other thing.
that did not have the states represented equally in at least one of the branches of the legislature, of what would become Congress. Meanwhile, delegates from the large states thought it would be better for congressional apportionment to be based on population. Because of the nature of this new government.
Which I think inevitably, just when it comes to that democracy, that just makes sense too. Like, hey man, population, like most people, most vote. Like, I get that too. Like that's just straightforward.
Government.
Oh, look, if you'll notice in the bottom, like the four, yeah, he cites all the sorts stuff too. So that's what's really nice. So you'll be able to go down here and bam, 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 bam. Like he has good, yeah, he cites his sources. So if you ever have any point, some of this stuff, you're like, what? Yes. You probably have a cited.
Government was not simply going to be a federation of states.
Good academic
like the old
shit.
government was.
That's what I like
This was
about
going to be a
academics.
government that derived its authority directly from the people. The states would still exist, but the federal government would also be its own thing, independent of the states. So the thinking of many delegates was, of course, apportionment of Congress is going to be based on population. The members, the people elected to Congress, are going to be elected by the people directly.
Sure.
So this became a big division within the members of the convention, and they were at an impasse for weeks, going back and forth on this issue. And it looked like the small states were going to walk, and that would be the end of the whole project. And so finally they reached a compromise where one of the houses of...
So can I compromise the way of protecting the small interests of the state? Senate each... yep. Pretty much the way our system is. Literally was a compromise of saving the small states. I mean, that is about... I think that's pretty straightforward. I mean, that's what I like about this guy, too. A lot of times, a lot of stuff he'll say is just so straightforward. You're just like, yeah. But yeah, so... This is, I think, important for people to remember and think about when it comes to why we have the system we have. Why the Senate exists. I mean, you can, once again, maybe you can say, like, oh, now with the way things are, maybe we shouldn't have, blah, blah, blah. But at least at the time being, once again, makes perfect sense why they would have a Senate.
Congress, the Senate, would have equal representation of the states, and how it ended up being done was each state has 2 senators, and then the other house of Congress, the House of Representatives, would be based on population. So the more population a state has, the more representatives it has.
Which, by the way, a lot of other countries do. England,
the 3/5
clause,
clause
a lot of different countries. It's
was
pretty normal.
actually something that was carried over from previously. It had been proposed under the Articles of Confederation. It had not passed, and then they carried it over into in this, a few years later, when they had the Constitutional Convention, they brought that idea with them. That's a whole topic unto itself.
Mm-hmm.
It really needs its own video to discuss. So
I think that's fair.
We're just going to go with the fact that the 3/5 clause held that win deciding on apportionment for the House of
No, I think some people might say, oh, that's a cop out. Let's talk about it now. Nah, he's right. That does deserve its own video. The three-fifths clause, the three-fifths compromise. I mean, like you gotta remember, this led to eventually the Civil War. I mean, this was just the slavery issue is just such an underlying aspect of American politics and culture and everything, you know? So it definitely deserves its own kind of focus. So I respect that.
Representatives. You count the total number of free people in that state, and then you take the total number of slaves and multiply that by 3/5, or 60%. And that's how you decide how many representatives that state gets. So these two features, the Connecticut Compromise and the 3/5 clause, made certain states, small population states and states with large slave populations, more inclined to having Congress choose the president than having a direct election of the president. And like I said, direct election of the president was non-starter. But it also made those states disinclined to having an electoral college. The electoral college was an idea that was put forward by the same delegates that had put forward the idea of a direct election of the president. James Wilson and Gouverneur Morris, like I said, they were the main proponents of having the president chosen directly by the voters. They were also the main proponents of having an electoral college.
This makes me so much more sympathetic. Oh my goodness. The fact that it was the same people, I mean, it's sounding more and more like the Electoral College was just the way of them compromise, being like, okay, you gotta give us something here. You gotta give us something. And they're like, fine, that's your something. Ugh, man. Kind of makes me, I mean, this does make me respect the Electoral College, at least historically. You know, it does. Like, whether I approve of it still being used today or not, I think that's a whole different matter. I think there's so many factors that have changed that I think it's easy to argue against many of the points of these historical points. But like understanding why it came to be is just
those two things is going together. They saw the Electoral College as the next best thing to popular election,
which is fair. Comparatively,
in modern American discourse, we tend
competitive
to talk about
by the two options. Yeah, I would have done the Electoral College
in contrast to popular election is something that replaced popular election or usurped popular election, and it takes away people's rights directly to choose the president. You know, a lot of Americans talk like that. That's not how it was seen at the time.
Right.
Wilson and Morris.
And I can see why they wouldn't have saw it like that at the time.
As something that's kind of an outgrowth of popular election.
Sure.
And the way you can think of it, they didn't talk about it in these terms, at least not that I'm aware of, because I don't think they felt the need to justify an electoral college as opposed to direct election. I think it just was obvious to them. But I think the logic that they were operating under was it's kind of like how we make laws in a democracy. In a democratic government, the people make the laws. That's what a democracy is. But we don't make the laws. I don't make the laws. I don't. I go to the voting booth once every 2 years, and I cast a ballot, and whoever gets elected as my representative, that representative helps to make the laws. The representative represents me and hundreds of thousands of other Americans and makes laws on our behalf. And we don't see that as taking away our rights or taking away our power. That is our power. Our power is to choose who's going to make the laws on our behalf. And I think they thought of the Electoral College in the same way.
Which once again, I can understand why he would think like that. And no, Nailman, I have good memories all across my lifetime. I can understand where they were coming from. Like like I said, that's why I really like this guy in his videos. He's really good at making you think about from their perspective. He's putting you in their shoes, making you think like, okay, this is what they were thinking. This was in their mindsets. This is like he helps you move forward with them as in history and like what's in their minds. And I think that's so important. That's so important in terms of history. So we can learn about like this happened at this day and this was this date and blah blah blah, but these were people. These were human beings just living, breathing like you and I. They just happen to live in just different time period, but they're still human beings.
They thought of the Electoral College as you're choosing electors, and the electors are going to choose the president on your behalf. And it's the same. It's kind of the same set of issues that are involved. Like, why don't we all just make the laws together? Why don't we all just see a slate of?
Although, oh, sorry, I don't I keep pausing, but it's funny because there are places that do direct ballot initiatives. So in those cases, we do. We actually kind of do. I mean, I say this as a good old Michigander. In Michigan, we have numerous. In fact, that's literally how cannabis became legalized here. Is because of direct ballot initiative, and I think yeah, and I think that's actually what's the case. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think most states, like all but maybe a few, or I think all of them did it that way. Now I think about it, I'm trying to think of a single state that maybe there was like one or two that did it via state legislation, but I think all of them did like a popular referendum. So it's a thing, but I know where he's coming from at the time. Yeah.
Laws proposed. We go online and we look and we see these laws and we decide, we click a box, yes or no. Why don't we make all our laws that way democratically? Why do we have this institution,
I mean,
Congress,
nowadays that's probably where we're going to
stands
go
between
is that
us and the
direction
lawmaking?
that he's talking about.
It's because
As
making
people want
laws is
more and more direct
complicated.
democracy.
We, as individuals, don't have all the expertise. We trust that the person we vote for
And see,
is,
that's the
they're
assumption
gonna
that's
have a
changing. Is
staff,
that
they're gonna, be
people
well
are
informed,
starting to
they spend
gain
all
more
day,
and more
in
knowledge.
theory, they spend all
Not
day
perfect
studying
knowledge,
these laws
unfortunately,
and
but
studying how they
enough
go to
so
hearings and they
to make more decisions.
they spend time in committee and discuss the issue. They do all that because we don't have the time to do that because we have other things to do, and so we delegate that responsibility to them. And choosing the president is a similar sort of thing, at least from the perspective of 1787, where they were thinking that people aren't going to be familiar with Americans in different parts of the country. They're not going to be able to
That's
figure
fair.
out who's going to be the best man for the job because they don't know all the somebody from North Carolina is not going to know who are the prominent statesmen from New York.
And see, that's just something else we have to think about too when we're thinking about like the context of these different even political systems. Because nowadays you can't. I mean, people are just typically a little bit more well traveled, and even if you don't travel, you have TV, you have media. You're going to probably probably have some way of talking with other folks from other regions in some way. Like more people are going to be more enabled to do that, and with that, and so now you can notice how arguments at the time that made sense for why things like the Electoral College existing and why they would have just made the assumptions they would about the people were much more valid back then than they are now. And then be fair, like, how the founding fathers ever seen this?
Who
The
has the
internet.
best character?
You know what I mean?
They're not going to be able to evaluate that. They're not going to have access to the information. But you elect an elector, and then that elector has a few weeks that they, presumably that elector for the first, to begin with, will already be well informed and has a good character and has the best interest of the country at heart. You choose your elector based on their character and also based on how well informed they are about the country. They're presumably somebody who has some, experience.
Unfortunately, those assumptions I think are part of the reason why the Electoral College doesn't work because we definitely don't have that with electors. It's because of party politics. Which, to be fair, Washington was like, hey, we don't want this. I mean, just don't do the party politics thing. That's literally going to undermine all this stuff that we had built here. And I mean, I don't think he's entirely wrong. I think the only thing I would have said to Washington is yeah, but they're kind of inevitable, dude. So you gotta have a system that's the best deal with political parties because they're just inevitable in democracies. You're just inevitably going to have groups of people, like-minded people. They're going to coalesce together and be like, hey, let's form a thing, like a party or some sort of unit, some sort of coalition, whatever. You know what I mean? I think it's just inevitable.
In politics, they're familiar with people in different parts of the country. They would be in a better position than a random farmer to know who among all the statesmen in the country is the best man for the job.
Right. Although nowadays that random farmer,
that
he's surprisingly educated.
And the
random farmer guy can know some things nowadays.
So from the perspective of James Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, they did not see that as any more usurpation of our rights as voters than they would see us electing members of the House of Representatives as a usurpation of our rights to control the lawmaking.
Mm-hmm.
They saw it. They saw it in similar terms. So they put forward the idea of an electoral college, and the electoral college would solve some of the issues that would
People
that
watch
pertained
whatever
to
nowadays. It's
Congress.
good
It
stuff,
solved
man.
the
Learn your
issue
history.
with regard to direct election.
Everything
in
else will be
that,
brain
you
rot.
solve the problem of low information voters, and people. You don't solve the problem of people only voting for people in their own state.
I mean, solving that low information voter thing, I am very sympathetic with. Because, like, I mean, that is a big issue to this day. That is a huge issue. I mean, voters are just not informed enough. I don't even feel necessarily informed enough. And so I can't, yeah, like, I don't think any of us are have to really informed enough. Like, that is a real issue. And so, like, I can understand why, from their perspective, they just think, well, we're the educated ones. Whether that was, narcissistic, egotistical, all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. Whatever you may think of why they thought that, whether that was right or wrong, the fact that they thought that, and they're like, well, we don't want to deal with low, because that can undermine this whole enterprise.
That was still expected to be something the electors would probably do. But and on the other hand,
The
though,
state
it would
thing,
also
like,
solve the problem of Congress.
Yeah.
Congress, you're open to factionalism, you're open to foreign influence. Those wouldn't happen in Electoral College because the Electoral College forms, elects the president, and then immediately.
Oh, founding fathers! Oh no! I just no factionalism, no foreign influence, eh? Eh? Just APAC walks into the room. Don't mind me. Oh, God. Okay. Anyways.
Disbands. So there's not time for factions to form. There's not time for foreign governments to try to gain
founding
influence
fathers,
over
you poor.
members of the Electoral College. It also solves the problem of separation of powers, because the Electoral College would only exist within the executive branch.
That does.
So you wouldn't have the problem of the legislative branch
That
controlling
does.
who becomes president. It's a totally different institution that's deciding who becomes president.
I gotta give credit with that.
The small states and the slave states were still skittish about this. I'm using slave states a little bit anachronistically because there was still some slavery in the North. But by slave states, I mean, the southern states that had large populations of slaves.
Fair enough.
They were.
At least he clarified that, though.
Electoral College. They knew that they had an advantage within Congress of how to choose the president. These other ideas, I think Wilson talked about, having the number of electors be proportional to the population of each state. That wasn't going to fly with the small states and the slave states because they had more of an advantage in Congress.
Right.
Morris, I believe, put forward an idea of, well, how about we have large states have 3 electors, medium-sized states have 2 electors, small states have 1 elector. Well, that wasn't going to work. So they bandied about this idea of an electoral college, but the majority of delegates never liked the idea, and it was never adopted until September. So like I said, the convention met from May until September.
Bring it back
so
to this
as it was
original
getting
thing.
into September, they had been there for 3 months at this point, more than 3 months.
Right. No, that's like
They
5 months.
formed a
6
committee
months.
that has different names, but it basically was a committee of 11 individuals, 1 delegate from each state that was currently in attendance. And it was chaired by David Brearley, a delegate from New Jersey. And their job was to take all the bits and pieces of matters related to the Constitution that had not yet been decided and try to hash out a new draft and put that stuff together and then present it to the delegates as a whole for their approval. And so it's at that point that they hashed out an electoral college that would actually be acceptable to the majority of delegates. So what I'm going to do here is read from that section of the Constitution.
Say what?
The selection of the president.
Dude,
and I'm going to go
reading the
point by point
Constitution?
how each aspect
Who does
of
that?
the selection process was designed specifically to address the concerns
This is where
of
everyone's
some
like, well,
set
certainly
of
not the
delegates at
president,
convention.
certainly not Congress.
Each state shall
political
appoint,
joke here.
in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors. So each state shall appoint. That means the states have some control over the election process. There was concern raised by some of the delegates that if the selection of the president has nothing to do with the states, that some of the states won't ratify the Constitution. The states are going to be worried that they're going to lose their existence in this new system, that they'll be swallowed up by a new national government. So they threw this in as a bone toward those states, making the states involved and making the states feel like they have a role in the selection process. And then it continues, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. So here's the big breakthrough. The small states and the slave states maintain their advantage that they have in Congress. So they get the exact same advantage in the Electoral College that they get in Congress. The small states get the advantage of the fact that each small state has 2 senators equal to every large state having 2 senators.
Right.
That's reflected in the Electoral College. And then the slave states would have the advantage of having that 60% of slave population number added to their free population number for purposes of congressional apportionment. That's also going to be reflected in the Electoral College. So that's why it's set up as...
See, so which is why it's funny to say, you can kind of argue that, like, the Electoral College isn't really relevant in the United States when, well, we got rid of this whole slavery issue. Like, clearly at the time, yeah, slavery was a bigger issue. They had to do something like an Electoral College, which is, when you have to think about it, that means a lot of American institutions are, yeah, they have that imprint. That's why people talk about having that imprint of slavery on there. Like, people were making compromises, people were making these political, these negotiations with this always in mind. This is always, because this is a huge factor into the economy. This is a huge factor in everything. I mean, obviously, morally wrong, but, that goes without,
You take the number of senators that a state has and the number of representatives that a state has, you add that together, and that's how many electors that state has. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector.
Right, I think it's obvious.
So that gets to the idea of maintaining the strict separation of
Right.
the legislative and executive branches.
Exactly.
A member of the legislative branch, a member of Congress, is not eligible to serve as an elector. The electors shall meet in their respective states. During the convention, whenever the Electoral College was discussed, it was assumed that the Electoral College would meet as a single body in the national capital.
Interesting.
But one of these new ideas that came out of this committee
See, I didn't know
was
that. I didn't know
have
that.
the Electoral College meet state by state. So the electors in each state would meet within that state.
Right.
And that's how it's still done. It's always been done that way. So even today, when electors
That's-
are chosen...
See, that's why I'm surprised to hear that that there's people assuming otherwise, that it would have been like one just. I didn't know that. I didn't know that they would have had made us. But,
typically in the state capitol, typically in some office in the state capitol building, they'll meet up together and conduct the election process. But by having the electors in separate states, spread out in all the different states, makes it so that there's less chance of factionalism from happening. There's less chance. It's basically impossible for factionalism to happen because they're not all meeting together.
right. That's fair.
There's hardly any chance for foreign interference. And also, it addressed an issue that was
I
raised.
mean, be careful with that one. I don't know how. Actually, I really don't know how it would have, because then the foreign interest could have just infiltrated the state itself. I guess I'm a little confused at how that would actually stop the foreign influence, especially with today's system. I mean, maybe that's that. I mean, I guess maybe thinking about how this system of governance would have been. I mean,
Raised
I don't see how that would
the
have stopped the foreign
objections to an
influence.
electoral college was the fact that some states are located far away, or will be located far away from the national capital, and it would be more onerous for them to send electors to the national capital simply for this purpose. It's one thing to elect senators and representatives to go and serve in Congress, and they're there permanently or semi-permanently in the national capital.
Right.
But to have this institution, the Electoral College, which only exists for a few weeks, you elect it, it elects the president and immediately disbands. It would be hard to find people willing to serve in an Electoral College that come from distant states, someplace like Georgia or New Hampshire. And actually, this objection was raised by a delegate from Georgia. But for them, it would be several weeks round trip just to do this one thing.
Right.
So
Once again, we're
I
thinking
think it was
about
Houston,
the-
Georgia, that was making this objection. You could have a situation where distant states just
What?
was making this objection. you could have a situation where distant states just aren't sending all their electors. Some of the electors won't show up, or maybe they're not able to send electors at all. So they would be disenfranchised in relation to states that are closer to the capital. So this was another way of mitigating that. The electors meet in each state, within each state. So that eliminates that problem. So the electors shall meet in their respective states.
Right. Okay.
And vote by ballot for 2 persons, of whom one at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. This addresses the favorite son problem, the idea that electors would almost always simply vote for someone within their own state.
Okay.
How do you mitigate that? That was another thing that was discussed when they were talking about an electoral college. How do you stop electors from simply all voting for the person within their own state? What you're going to end up with is electors from big states are going to vote for their own, fellow members of that state, citizens of that state. People from small states would do the same, and the president is always going to be someone from a big state. So how do you prevent that? And so the solution that the committee came up with was they choose 2 electors. You can't stop somebody from voting for somebody within your own state. You may not necessarily want to, but if each elector votes for 2 people, and one of them has to be from out of state, they'll still vote for their favorite son, but then presumably the other vote would be for someone who is actually well qualified. But then the concern was raised, okay, but then people are just going to throw away their second vote, because they're going to try to get the person from their state elected, so they'll just throw away the other vote. They'll just vote for some random person, right? So how do you stop that from happening? So then they created the office of vice president, and whoever came in second place in the electoral vote count would become vice president.
Okay.
That would incentivize the electors to take both of their votes seriously. And so the idea was probably what would happen is in all the states.
That's very fascinating. So that's how the vice president. I think I already kind of knew that, but it's something I just forgot. But yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that does make you think. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense to why the vice presidency does exist. And people think of it as some throwaway position. I mean, still the president of the Senate. They don't necessarily, they don't vote unless there's a tie, but that's probably the most critical time to be able to vote. So, you know what I mean? Like, vice presidency is not nothing. It's not nothing. And you can see how it literally was helpful in making this country even foundational in the first place.
Electors, one of their votes would be for someone in state. The other vote would be for some prominent statesman that has national stature. And then, so their second vote would be the one who becomes president. And then perhaps, just the person who becomes vice president is a person from a large state or whatever. And if no person have a majority, then from the 5 highest on the list, the said House shall in like manner choose the president, House being the House of Representatives. One of the things that was discussed at the convention was, does someone become president with a plurality of the vote or with a majority of the vote? And there are problems either way. If it's by plurality of the vote, then you could have a situation where someone becomes president with only 10 or 15% of the vote.
Right.
And some of the delegates fully expected that would happen in an electoral college situation because, people spread out over different states and voting mostly for people within their own state and whatever.
It's just fascinating to me. They really didn't see how the phenomenon of how just political parties in general would really consolidate a lot of this, and people would start voting across state lines. I mean, this just I think comes to show people I don't think realized at the time how much more like state they were thinking in terms of being a Virginian, or a Pennsylvanian, a New Yorker. They really were thinking a lot deep into those were really much more deep. I mean, they still are for folks today, but definitely not in the same way as just being like an American is. Like, we really have to always remember that, and that's why so much of our legal system is the way it is. And that's why I think, like, for example, Thomas Jefferson even knew, like, eventually systems have to change. And he knew that, like, because mentalities change, the country is going to change its attitude, it's going to evolve. So, anyways.
And there, some of the delegates thought it was going to be unusual for there to be people of national stature that a wide variety of electors would be voting On the other hand, not everybody, by the way, not everybody did think that. Some of the delegates did think that over time, as the country became more knitted together and there was more of a national culture, that there would be national figures and it would be more likely that
See,
electors would vote for a majority.
imagine
So
being
it
one of
wasn't
those
all the
folks.
delegates that expected that,
Right.
but some of them did. On the other
Now
hand,
imagine being
if you
those
say
folks,
that
because those folks essentially got
someone
right.
has to have a majority
Those folks
in order
got
to
right.
become president, then what happens when you have nobody gets a majority? What then? You have a runoff election, or what do you do?
Right.
So in that scenario, the way they set it up, the backup is to have it go back to.
Because think about it. Because back in the day, I mean, because nowadays we could probably have like a whole automated system, like a ranked choice voting system, and you could just put in your ones and two, like you rank them, and then like the system can automate all of that and do like an automated runoffs until someone reaches that majority point, or even whatever threshold you want. Even if you wanted to have it be more than 50%, say you wanted to be 60%, say you wanted to be 70%, whatever percentage you had, you could have it automatically lead to runoff, you know, nowadays via computers, info, you have all that information. You don't have to do constant like he's going to explain, as it was a whole ass, as opposed to a whole ass process.
Congress, which was the original plan. Up, the backup is to have it go back to Congress, which was the original plan, right? The original plan, the plan they had from the beginning, the original draft, the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, the draft, the working draft, all through the summer, it always had Congress is going to choose a president. So what they did is they made that the backup. If the Electoral College can't settle on a majority, then they go to the backup, which is Congress chooses.
Now,
But not Congress as a whole.
that just makes me think of it from a human psychological point of view, like a human bias point of view. Like imagine being some of these dudes sitting in this room. You've been sitting here for months. You all been like intensely arguing, intensely debating. While there's something probably for those folks who felt like, oh man, we really want that Virginia, who wanted that initial thing. Now imagine it's coming back at the table. It's like a backup plan. Or maybe you're the one that proposed it because you're like, well, this is our way of having it be somewhat relevant still. We can still have it be the backup plan, and we'll assume all this other nonsense is not going to work, and then we'll just go back to the default, the whole thing that we knew was going to be the entire time in their minds. So that's just like, it's fascinating to think of it from that point of view. And I think with the way he's explained this, I think it really helps set that up and puts you in the position to think that way.
Rather just the House of Representatives. But then it goes on. But in choosing the president, the votes shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having one vote. So it's chosen by the House of Representatives, but that gives an advantage to large states. So to protect the interest of the small states, they say it'll be decided by the House of Representatives, but each state delegation has one vote collectively. So the New York delegation collectively has one vote, Pennsylvania delegation one vote, New Jersey one vote, etc. So that was a way of giving an advantage to the small states. Now that they had changed the method of electing the president from having Congress do it to having Electoral College do it, they then needed to address the term of office of the president. It would no longer make sense for the president to serve a 7-year term, or potentially longer, but at this point it was just 7 years. 7-year term without possibility of re-election. That made sense with Congress choosing the president. It would not make sense with the president being chosen by the people, indirectly by means of the Electoral College. So they shortened the term to 4 years and made him eligible for re-election. Shortening the term was, the idea behind that was that it made him more answerable to the people. The thinking at the time was, the shorter your term of office is, the more answerable you are to the people, the more your actions in office reflect what the people want.
Because remember I was saying, I kind of always thought, well, why not have it, be like a one longer term? You can see now where they're just thinking of why they, and I think there's some truth to that. I mean, especially, let's face it, like House of Representative folks are definitely way more held accountable to people than like a senator is, or even president by comparison, because of those term lengths. I mean, it's almost to the point where it's almost like too much, because like they have to always be in electoral appeal mode instead of just like getting stuff done mode. Ideally, those should be both as one and the same thing, obviously, but I mean, that's the solution, right? That's the ultimate solution. Well, those two should be both in the same thing. But um, this is an interesting point he brings up. I personally probably would have said like, well, still just make it easy for the president to give him one long term, but make it, I guess, easy. Or by when I say easy, I say easier than it is now to boot them out, especially if they're just doing corrupt stuff. I mean, right, that's all.
The longer your term in office,
I mean,
the
the
more
UK,
independent you are, the more
they
able
can
you are
kick
to
folks
have
out
some
pretty
latitude
easily.
in your
That's what I'm
judgment.
just saying.
So they went with 4 years to make the president closer to the people, and then make him eligible for re-election to make him motivated to do what the people want.
Sure.
Some of the delegates at the time talked about how if you're eligible for re-election, then you're going to be thinking about how do I get re-elected, right? That was the concern with having president eligible for re-election when chosen by Congress. You don't want him to be beholden to Congress or trying to please it. But you do want the president to be beholden to the people and trying to please the people.
Right. It's like,
so you want him
I
to
can
always be
understand
able
why
to
they're
be
like,
re-elected.
oh, well,
So the
oh no, he's
intention was
beholden
the
to the
president would
people. I get it.
be able to be re-elected indefinitely, that he could serve multiple terms. As long as the people wanted him to stay in office, that would be fine. And as long as he has that expectation of he's going to be up for another election, he wants to be re-elected, that will motivate him to please the people. Now, I'm curious to hear what you think.
Now, mind you, oh, funny you asked that question because I'm going to do a whole reaction about it, but no. But, mind you, though, with that in mind, when they're thinking about, oh, they can keep going forever, obviously this is before Washington sets that sort of precedent of just have the 2 terms, which would be, which would be respected, though some did try to change it beforehand, but they were unsuccessful until, FDR. And obviously then that's because of, there's a whole world war, there's a whole big crisis. I thought it was pretty reasonable. I get it, it was just like it was under different circumstances. I think I would have been a little bit more suspicious. I mean, he wasn't, he had his flaws, but he's still a good president, in my opinion. But that's all other.
Obviously, it was very possible that the convention would have gone with having Congress choose the president. Do you think that would have been a good idea? Would it have been a good idea? Would it have been better to have Congress choose the president rather than have an electoral college choose the president? How would you have voted in the convention?
Back then? Yeah.
And alternatively, given that nowadays many Americans, a majority of Americans, think that the president should be elected through direct vote of the people.
Yeah, I'm in that camp.
If you had been a delegate at the convention in 1787, how would you have tried to persuade your fellow delegates, given the fact that most of them weren't sold on the idea, thought it was a really bad idea? How would you persuade them to go with direct election of the president in light of how people thought in 1787 and how they expected things to develop and how they don't have...
He's doing this. He's doing the thing I'm telling y'all he did. He's like, well, how you do it?
From the perspective of 1787, how do you persuade somebody that direct election of the president would be a good idea?
That's a good, valid point.
But anyway, I hope that was useful. Thanks for watching.
See, I like how he did that at the very end, too. He's asking, like, how would you have done it? And especially given this. Like I said, and look, all this, give you all the information, all the sources, and then, of course, the Patreon. But yeah, no, I think it was brilliant. Given that hindsight, I don't know if I could have. I mean, that's the funny thing, thinking about it at the time. I definitely would have voiced a lot of Jefferson when he talks about, like, how the Constitution, everything has to be rotated and cycled and changed. I definitely, by the end of that, would have been, like, on that camp and kind of that mindset and of, like, hey, I think that's the biggest thing maybe I would have been pushed, is to make sure the Constitution is not impossible to change, to make sure that it has room and an ability to change. I would have been definitely on that camp and to make sure that would maybe even more convenient than it is now in some ways. I don't know. Probably. I mean, I understand their caution. I get it. But like I said, if you make it impossible to change, and then the times change, you can't have a constitution that's not going with the times. the times and what the thing, whatever is going to happen is going to happen regardless of what the laws on the piece of paper say, and so it's best for the law on the piece of paper to reflect that as much as possible. And I think at the time, I mean, I think those sort of political changes would, I mean, come about slower than how they do today. I mean, today, because we are in the information age, we have the internet, we have all this stuff. Change can come about like in this way quicker, because that information can just travel like that, and that's a whole different dynamic that you know they could never thought of. So I mean, we got like this future brain kind of advantage and disadvantage, I guess, in this advantage, and I think in the sense of like a disadvantage in the sense it's harder for us to put ourselves in that mindset. But all right, this is an hour long video, so I think I'm going to stop the recording of the video now.